This is Martin Giles of the Guildford Dragon News, and this evening I'm at Guildford Borough Council offices to interview the new lead councillor for planning, Councillor Jan Harwood. Jan, how are you finding your role as lead councillor for planning?
Well, I'm really quite enjoying it. There's a huge amount to learn, and it's got its own challenges, obviously. My background is not in this area, so I've had to be quick on my feet. But given the time and the backdrop of various things going on at the borough, it's an interesting time to be involved in this.
Is it as you expected it to be?
In so much as it is from the outside looking in. Obviously there's a huge element of new stuff to learn when you're inside the building as such. But largely, yes.
Okay, and why do you think you were selected for planning?
There's a number of reasons for that. The two main ones is I don't have a history in this area, and perhaps there are people who would have felt a new face in planning would be appreciated with no historic attachment to any particular or any agenda, shall we say, in a particular direction. Secondly, my set of skills is essentially being able to absorb information quickly and be able to make informed decisions quickly in a sensible manner, and that sort of fit planning, where there's a huge amount of learning that had to be done before we even taking the post and moving forward as well.
So what is your normal work? I
used to be a trainee patent attorney. So as part of that, I would be reading patent documents,
okay.
and sort of digesting entire new technology and then making a legal argument.
So you've had legal training?
I have, yes, but in a very specific area.
Yes, okay. Now, what do you think of the local plan adopted in the dying days of the previous council?
That is a tricky question in a way, because there's two elements to it. What do I think of its adoption, and what do I think of the fact that it was adopted in the last 2 days, if I may separate your question out? And the fact that it was adopted in the last few days of the sitting previous administration, I can see how that may irk some people, and certainly left somewhat of a sour taste in my mouth. However, on further reflection, I think it's reasonable that a council that had been overseeing the process ultimately had a say in the outcome of that process, which was the adoption. So I can see why that is the route that was embarked upon. In terms of its actual adoption, the fact that it was adopted, I think that was again a tough and a complex decision for each individual councillor. And as a Liberal Democrat with no whip, we allowed, of course, every councillor to make their own decision on that.
But I really meant, what do you think of the plan?
It's a big plan. There's a lot of aspects to it. Do I love every aspect of it? No, I don't. Is it the plan that I would have, if on my own, would have made for all of the borough? No, probably not. But I think I recognise that the need to have a plan and the consequences of not having a plan, with keeping in mind the national constrictions placed on us, is essential. So ultimately, I think it's fortunate that the plan exists and that we can do better with it than we would have done without it.
Okay. Now, bearing in mind that your leader, Caroline Reeves, alone amongst the Lib Dem group, voted for the plan, how can there be a unified view amongst the Lib Dems on planning?
Well, first of all, I would perhaps question the need to have a unified view. It's a certain part of being a Lib Dem is having the freedom to make up your mind on what's best for the constituents you represent. Insofar as sort of practical moving forward as a council and the leadership of the council, how do we deal with that? Actually, we're all in agreement on how to move forward. The fact of the matter, in my mind, is that without a local plan, there were way too many challenges to proposals that were being allowed based on the planning framework as mandated by the national government. And the danger that proposed was of significant level for some of our members to feel that even though the plan was not perhaps the plan that they would have picked out or they would have wished upon, it was better than a no plan. And so that in the interests of the borough as a whole, it was better to have the plan. And I suspect that I don't want to put words in Caroline's mouth, but I think that would be her argument as well.
But she was the only one that voted for it.
Yes, and that is what I've explained is essentially her viewpoint on that. I know that others felt that regardless of that argument, it still wasn't what was best for their ward count, and therefore they voted the way they did.
Okay, now your party, the Lib Dems, they've traditionally been in favour of the devolvement of power generally. will it do more at a national level now to stop the centralisation of planning power if they're in a position to do so? Or what would they, should they draw up a policy that would do that if they obtain power?
I mean, that's a very difficult question for me to answer, sitting at a local level. I mean, the outcome of that will largely depend on the national picture and what we may end up with any given general election or power sharing that may result from a split parliament. But certainly, I think we would stand by our recognition of the need for devolvement, mainly because local issues are not uniform across the whole country. And so this notion that you can simplify planning by applying a single flat rule across the whole country, I think is resulted in some of the problems we face. So I think that's the angle I would like to see taken at the national level, which is that simplification does not necessarily have to mean one-size-fits-all kind of rule application.
Okay. Now, the main controversy around the local plan, you may agree, is around the proposals for large-scale developments in the Greenbelt. Given the environmental damage that they will cause at a time when the threat of climate change is becoming more and more recognised, are you in favour of building on green spaces and in particular on the Greenbelt?
Well, in all honesty, I would like to challenge that question to an extent. It's often put forward that these are diametrically opposed positions, to provide housing and to protect the environment. And I would argue that's the problem, is that we see it as an opposed view. Actually, what we should be looking at is how do we integrate those two things and how we provide housing that integrates with the environment as opposed to destroys the environment. And I think we have an opportunity here in Guildford to address and tackle that very issue. I don't think it's necessarily true that just because a developer's planned on a green site is by automatically bad for the environment. And on the other side of that coin, I don't believe that just because you build on a brown site is somehow you're good for the environment. I think the complexity of the situation is much more nuanced than that. And the way I would like to move forward is that bring up the standards of development and change almost a culture of development to integrate with our environment and have environmental concerns sit atop any decision making that goes on. And I don't actually necessarily mean that just at a planning level, but across the whole borough, that when we make decisions, we should be factoring in those and looking forward to how we can do so in a sustainable, and I use that word sustainable in a true sense, not the current somewhat perverse sense that's been utilized in, which is actually, can you do it? Yes, therefore it's sustainable because you could do it again, sort of almost approach that's pervaded the planning system. A true sustainable, in my mind, is something that we can accomplish that doesn't cause detriment to the environment.
But is it sustainable to use Greenbelt when at the end of the planning?
Perpetually, no, of course not. There's only a limited amount. But I mean, Guildford as a whole is 90%, over 90%, well, not anymore actually technically, but a Greenbelt. To suggest that we could somehow deal with the growing population and the growing economic demands and various other things without ever touching any of the Greenbelt, I think would be a foolish suggestion. I think that given that necessity, given that's a reality, we have to look at a more robust solution, which is so given that we have to address these issues, how do we do so in a way that isn't detrimental to the environment? And I think that the Greenbelt, use of the Greenbelt is a solution, is a part of that solution. So
okay, now in your manifesto you said, because of the government, there is no alternative to adopting a local plan, and we recognise that Guildford needs one, but we will ensure that the way in which it is implemented and applied matches the needs of residents. How will you do that?
Well, there's a mix of points there, really. There's the often spoken about point of affordable housing. That's a key issue, obviously. There's the standard of housing, the size of housing, and the type of housing. Sort of, whether we need more mansions with 4, 5, 6 bedrooms. There's an argument to be made. No, we don't. Certainly in certain areas, but obviously the issue is that the market-driven aspect of housing is a constraint on development. However you like to slice it up, that is just a fact of it. We would like, as a council, to put pressure on developers to make sure that the needs of the community are more strongly represented at an early developmental planning stage. And we would hope that would be reflected in the outcome of the development around Guildford Borough. So,
do you mean residents, though, or do you include in that people that want to come to the borough?
Both, yes. Absolutely both. And they need very different things. So it's not as simple as one size sort of fits all. Everyone actually, there are very separate needs, and actually, different parts of the borough require different needs based on the growth rates of the different parts. So it's a complex problem in many ways.
Okay, now again, looking at your manifesto, you've said you've made stated several intentions. Firstly, to prioritise the development of brownfield sites, which is an old chestnut. But how will you actually do that? It's not as simple as saying you'll do it, is it? Because it depends on the wishes of the owner. Absolutely,
and the fact of development in many ways is that the landowner has the vast amount of the power. And given the land prices around Guildford, they dictate to a large extent what is and what isn't possible.
So what can you do about that?
Well, there are a number of things we can do. In many ways, the total amount of money available for any project is dictated by a combination of the value of the land and the potential of that land. And how that gets allocated is actually up for debate in many ways, is up for negotiation. So historically, the landowners have controlled and led the argument on that because they get the largest slice of the pie. And so when we want to do things like increase standards, environmental standards for housing, or provide lower density or more affordable housing, the cut that requires to bottom lines is actually tends to be footed by developers or private individuals, etc. The landowner tends to get away with not really having to worry about that. They just sell the land and then they take their chunk of the pie, if you will. But I think that there is scope to and suppress is the wrong word, but certainly force the issue on landowners that the value of the land and its availability for development is tied to the standards that we now require as a borough, and that just because it's your land and you want to sell it for housing doesn't mean that you get to maximise your profit, absolutely, because we need the housing. I think there is scope in there to spread the costs.
What sanction do you have against the owners?
Well, ultimately, we control the planning. So if we do not consent to the level of quality and style and type of development that we need, we will not grant planning. And then
right.
What value is your home, your land?
Well, apart from just about 200 yards from where we're sitting, then we've got the Plaza site, which has been empty, I think, for about nearly 25 years.
And you would think that people would be sensible and meet halfway, somewhere there'll be compromise made, and that's the key point. I think that this is an interesting problem in many ways, because of course the temptation for any individual that is not politically aligned is to just to wait out the political system to a certain extent. If I'm not playing ball, then they can perhaps. There's an intention that would wait me out, but I don't think that necessarily is true anymore.
But do you think that the only real answer is for legislation at a national level?
Oh, I mean, that would, of course, have a huge impact. But I think unless there is a serious change in the regime at Parliament, I think that's not on the cards. So we have to do what we can at a local level.
Okay. Now, you also said that you're going to insist that any greenfield developments come with infrastructure. Again, that's easily said, but if the constructors go to appeal and they win the appeal, it doesn't matter what you think about the infrastructure requirements.
Absolutely, and again, it's actually a fairly complex issue in that our ability to force the issue and force a particular level of standard is difficult. Again, and our hands are largely tied by the national level. But it's about working out ways to do that. And I think actually what I'd really like to foster, and it ties into an earlier question about integrating with our environment, what I'd like to foster is a culture change almost in development, which is that we need to move away from maximizing absolute profit and move towards actually we need to think more long term. There's the impending climate emergency that we face. There's other factors. If we're going to move forward and have sustainable development in the true sense of the word, we need to look at it in a different light.
But the developers, that is what their intention is, to maximise profit.
But not all developers are equal.
Okay.
And there are people who recognise that there is a grander picture at play. And I think it would be the intention of this council to work with those who identify with that vision.
Okay, now you also said that you're going to draw up and implement a master plan for town centre development. But my information is that the council officers here say that we can't now bolt on a master plan to the local plan.
There are a number of points there, and I can't give you a single sentence answer on that. starting from the beginning, our intention is absolutely to look at the town centre planning as a collective and move forward in a way that's more robust and longer term planned. How we achieve that is a matter of policy making and finding routes forward. And I think whilst it would be difficult at this point to allocate extra land to tack on, as you said, to the local plan, I think that would be very difficult because it would be challenged, as you suggested. We can to pull in the various pieces, nothing stopping us to look at it as a collective and connect projects that perhaps were previously unconnected.
Who would challenge it?
Developers would challenge it. Allocation of site, the argument I suspect would be that either it's a site, and if it was a site, why wasn't it in the local plan? I don't want to comment on speculatively what would happen, but some of the legal advice on that is that that would be a difficult route. I think there are alternative routes to achieving the end result that is perhaps...
But you still accept that a master plan is necessary?
Yeah. What we call it is whatever... Yes, I think the approach of planning for the town centre as a collective across the whole range of the town centre as opposed to in piecemeal is absolutely necessary, yes.
Okay. Now you say that you're going to work with the residents. Do you feel that the consultation on the local plan was well done?
I'm not sure if that's for me to answer in many ways, because I don't think I can give an honest answer to that, having not been inside this building at the time of that process. From the outside, I can form an opinion, but I'm not sure if that has any merit now that I sit.
Well, what we do know from the outside, which I was obviously as well,
sure,
is that there were lots of comments opposing, for instance, the green belt development.
Sure.
Not all about that,
sure,
but a lot of it was, and they outweighed by far the amount of comments in support of greenfield development. So, do you think, therefore, that they were given due weight in the consideration?
I'm not sure if you're what exactly it is you're asking me in a way. Do I think that those views have merit? Yes, absolutely.
No, I'm not, right. So let me phrase it another way. Do you think that the plan was changed enough to take account of those views that were represented?
I don't feel I can answer that question in many ways because I wasn't a part of that process, and
okay.
So I'm not intimately aware of to what extent that was.
But you presumably know how much it was changed after those.
Yes, I'm aware of it, but for example, I don't know the full details on every comment or the level of comment in one way or the other. I simply don't have that information. I mean, I'm happy to give a further answer on that if I have an opportunity to look further into it.
Okay, and finally, you've got the commitment to deliver 3,000 council houses. Mm. So tell me how you're going to do that. Again,
it's absolutely one of our key manifesto pledges. And the way to deliver it, I think, is to look for opportunities where it just makes sense to deliver that kind of housing. And I think that's very much dependent on project to project and from site allocation to site allocation. I think that certain sites are much more conducive to getting those kind of housing needs in partnership with the kind of development that the developers want to do. And in other areas, it will be more difficult. The key point I think will apply across the board is that we want more council houses, and we need to have a solid reason when any development why they're not contributing to that number. And so it's largely about holding to account to the developers to explain to us why it is that they can't deliver what we want.
Okay, but we're talking about council houses
yes.
here. Okay, not affordable houses.
No, of course.
I just wanted to clarify. Okay, and to deliver those, it seems to me you will need land or someone,
yes.
And you will need funding.
Yes. Okay, so the key point here is really that the affordable housing figure, which is 40%, which we would pursue, I think it would be difficult in certain allocations to argue for both 40% affordable and council housing on top of that. So I think there may be some points in which we have to make a compromise on that to achieve some of our goals. I think that's just a reality of what we're going to have to face. But I think that's the key point, is that perhaps we can give and take in a little bit areas to achieve across the whole borough the kind of targets we're setting. That it's a
okay, and the funding?
The funding for
the council houses.
Oh, right. Again, there is a number of factors to that, and I know that there's perhaps an inclination to build more housing through our own housing company. The problem with that is that tends to fall foul of right to buy, and that is again a national problem that we can't fix it at a local level. And so we're looking at ways to really work around or work with that issue, shall I say.
Okay, and when are you going to deliver these 3,000 council houses by?
I mean, you're holding me to, I don't know if you're looking for an exact date on this, but
Well,
over the course of the local plan, this is the aim.
I'm only reading what's in your manifesto.
Yes, I appreciate that, but it's an early priority, which means that I'm already mindful of the need for this, given the shortage we have. So it means that for any large project, this is very much at the forefront of our approach.
Okay, because the good news is that most people from across the political spectrum agree with this.
As much as I would love to be able to translate support into actual action, as I say, there's so much I am bound by in terms of what I am physically capable of achieving. The point I'd like to get across is that we've stated our intent, and I'd like to be able to back it up with our actions on how we achieve this. I don't want to promise something that I can't deliver ultimately. You have promised it. Yes, and we think this is achievable. We haven't, as part of that pledge, we haven't quite set out an exact date by which we do it because we don't know. But that's the road we're embarking upon, and I think it's achievable through the number of allocations that we have, and given the housing numbers that we're working with, I think that it fits within that picture, and I think it's entirely achievable.
Councillor Jan Harwood, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.